What is up, friends, and welcome back to our Intro to Java web series. In today's video, we're going to be going over loops. Now, there are three different types of loops, and they all serve different purposes, I would say. For the most part, when it comes to programming, and if you have to use a loop, you'll be able to determine which loop to use based off of what you're trying to do. And I'll try to explain that the best I can in under 15 minutes. Now, looping is something that I do in all my programs. I don't think I've written a program in the recent past where I wasn't using loops. So this is one of these topics that you really got to nail down to truly become a good Java programmer. So like I said, there's three different types of loops. We have the for loop, we have the while loop, and we have the do while loop. So the best way to explain these loops, actually I'll start coding before I start explaining them to you. I'm going to start off with the for loop example. So a for loop, setting up the for loop, it's actually very simple. You just start with the for keyword, which will allow the computer to know that you are about to enter a for loop. And then you have your parentheses for the parameters here. And I'll go over what goes within the parameters. The parameters, you have three different statements within these parameters. But before I get into that, I'll explain to you when you want to use your for loop. So what looping means is that you'll have a certain instruction that's going to be found within these block statements that you want to happen, and sometimes it needs to happen multiple times, right? It has to go back to the top of your program and loop through. So if you see here, after everything is executed within this block statement, it'll hop back up to the top of our loop, and then it'll check the parameters to see if it's true or not, and then it'll continue doing it while looping. So it's a literal loop where it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So within this for loop, you have three statements, like I said, and the first statement will be declaring an integer, and we'll call it I. A lot of programmers like to call it I. You can call it pretty much any letter you want. It could be J, it could be K, P, whatever you like. The name doesn't matter. But what you're going to do is you're going to have the integer, and you're going to set it equal to 0. You can set this value to other values where it's not 0. But for the most part, in the early programming practices, you'll start off with saying that integer equal to 0. So that's our first statement. We just declare an integer variable, and we set it equal to 0. Now the next part is we're going to set our parameters where we're setting a limit to how many times this is going to loop. So to do that, we're going to set I is less than something. Now the cool thing about for loops is that you know how many times you need to iterate through that loop. So maybe in this program we'll have it iterate 3 different times. So to do that, we'll have I is less than 3. Okay? Now in our last video, if you remember, we got into incrementing and decrementing. This is where it comes into play when it comes to loops. With our for loop, what we're going to do is in our third statement, we're going to increment I. So every time this loop goes through, it's going to increment that number I. Or after every time it reads this line of code and then goes to the next, I is going to be plus 1. That's how we do that. So all I'm going to do is just to put a simple system.out.println statement. We'll say testing right here. And also what we'll do is I'm going to add the value of I in there just to show you how I changes throughout this process. So for this for loop, we have int I is equal to 0 to start off, and that I is less than 3. Now you can think of this statement like an if statement, where as long as this statement is true, this process is going to loop. So while I is less than 3, the program is going to print out testing plus the value of I. I'm going to save it, compile it, run it, and just show you how it works. Do Java C loop practice.java. We'll do Java loop practice. And you see here, we have 3 different iterations, or it looped 3 different times in this process. And you can also see that I is incrementing through this process as well. So for the first loop, or the first iteration, I is equal to 0. So I is less than 3, and it prints out testing plus I, and in this case, I was 0. Now after it's done with this statement, it hops back to the top of the loop, and I is incremented, as stated here. So I is equal to 1. And then it tests this right here, where it says, is 1 less than 3? Yes. So it does another iteration, and so on and so forth. So the cool thing about for loops, or the only time you would really use for loops, is when you know how many iterations you're going to go through. You know how many times you want this process to go over and over. Maybe you're asking the user for 3 different numbers. You know you'd iterate the process 3 times. Stuff like that. So using for loops, you know the number of iterations you're going through. So that's very simple for the for loop. We also have the while loop. And the while loop is a pre-test loop. And I'll show you what that means in a second. So how about this? We'll do another incrementing example just because it's useful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare int variable. That int variable, I'm going to call it int num is equal to 0. So it's going to be very simple. I know how many iterations it could be, but within this while loop parameters, it could be multiple things. It could be even like a Boolean statement where it's while this Boolean variable is true, loop through this process, or while it's false, loop through this process. But what I'm going to do is while num is less than, let's say 5, it's going to do something. So I'm just going to do another system.out.print line, and we'll say testing while loop. And we'll also add num, just so we can see what the value of num is. So just know, using this while loop, we start off with the keyword while, and then we have our parameters. And whatever's within our parameters is what's going to stop the loop from looping. So while the num is less than 5, we're going to loop through the process. But as soon as num is not less than 5, it's going to hop out of that loop and it's going to go to the next bit or lines of code. Now I said before, this is a pre-test loop. So the while loop is a pre-test, while the do while is a post-test. And what I mean by pre-test is that before it hops into the loop, it actually checks these parameters, checks this statement right here. It'll check if num is actually less than 5. So for example, if num was 6, it wouldn't even do this loop because it's a pre-test and it realizes num is not less than 5. It does it here. Now I'm also going to increment num so I don't have an infinite loop. And I'll show you what an infinite loop is if we have time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to save, compile, and run it. Now you see here, we have 5 different iterations in our while loop. Right? So while num is less than 5, it's going to do this process. And you see here, these are the values of num. So it starts off at 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. So as soon as our num was equal to 5, 5 was no longer less than 5, so it hops out the loop and ends the loop there. Now, like I said before, it's a pre-test. So if we have num equal to 6, where 6 is not less than 5, our loop will actually not happen because the computer recognizes this is not going to happen because it does not meet the parameters. So you see how it's gone now? So this loop doesn't happen because it's a pre-test loop, right? So I'm just going to set this back to 0. So that's the do while. It's the pre-test loop where it checks before it hops in the loop if this statement is true or not. And while this is true, it's going to iterate through the process. So while num was equal to 0, it printed out testing loop, and then it incremented num to 1. And then it hopped back to up here. It says num, which is currently 1, is less than 5, so it does this process again. Goes back to the top, now num is 2, so on and so forth. till num was equal to 5, and 5 was no longer less than 5. Hopped out of that loop. Now let's try the do-while loop. Got 5 more minutes. So the do-while loop is not a pre-test, it's a post-test. So the do-while, the way it's set up is that you start off with the keyword do, you have your block statement, and at the end of the block statement, you will have your while. So you're doing while. So in this case, we'll create another variable. I'm going to call it num2. We'll say while this is less than 3. Gotta be sure to include our semicolon. So let me declare our int2 or num2 variable. Set that equal to 0. So in this do while, I'm going to have a simple system.out.println where it says testing do while loop. And then we'll do plus num2. Num2. There we go. And we also got to increment num2, so it's not an infinite loop. And I think we'll have time to show you what an infinite loop is. But like I said, the do while is a post-test loop. Now the cool thing about the do while is that it will at least iterate one time before hopping out the loop. This comes in handy when you're getting like user input. For example, I created a program where it tests to see if the password is correct that someone inputs. And in that case, we need the loop to at least iterate once where it asks the user for the input and then goes through. So it's the same for the do while. So it'll iterate one time. So no matter what num2 is, this will happen at least once, right? And then it'll check this statement and see if it's true or not. Now, if this is true, it'll hop back to the top and do it again. But if this is false, it'll hop out of the program. This is a very simple program, like I said. I'm going to save it, compile it, run it, just to show you. Now you see here, this is our first loop, where we set it to iterate 3 different times because I is less than 3. This is our while loop, which we set num is less than 5, so it iterates 5 different times in this case, because num starts off at 0. And in this do while, it iterates 3 different times because we set it to equal to 3. Now, it's not always going to be numbers for the parameters within a loop. Like I said, this is just like the simple ones. But you can see here in our do while that it starts off at 0, prints it out, then num2 becomes 1, and then num2 becomes 2. And as soon as num3 becomes 3, 3 is no longer less than 3, so it hops out of the loop. Now, let me show you an infinite loop. So an infinite loop is when sometimes your logic is a little off. Let's say while num2 is greater than 3, it'll continue to go through this loop. And I'm going to set num2 equal to 5. So if num2 is equal to 5 and it's getting incremented, it'll get incremented to 6, and then to 7, and then to 8, and then to 9. And in this case, all the numbers above 3 are going to be held in this num2 value. So you'll see what is called an infinite loop. Actually, did I save it? No. Got to save it real quick, compile it, and run it. Compile, run. Now you see it's just incrementing and incrementing and incrementing and incrementing. It'll go on forever because it'll never hop out of this loop because this right here will never be satisfied, or it'll never be false because that's how I set up the logic to be. So you got to be very careful about this logic. If you need some help understanding logic, revert back to my if-else video where it talks about if statements. They're very much the same, where you say if num1 or if num is less than 5, then it's going to do this process. So while these are true, it's going to loop through over and over and over again. And in this case, this will always be true. So we have an infinite loop. We're already at 80,000 increments at this point, going on 10,000. So I think that'll wrap it up for loops. I hope this helps you out, and happy coding, everyone.